Hello and welcome to Dialogo, a podcast of the Division of the Social Sciences at the University of Chicago. In each episode, we interview an alum of a graduate program in the Division of the Social Sciences here at UChicago, exploring their career path and reflecting on their time on campus. I am Kelly Pollack, Dean of Students for the Division of the Social Sciences.
And I'm Paul Post, Deputy Dean in the Social Science Division at the University of Chicago.
Today's guest is Rupal Patel, a 2005 graduate of our Master of Arts program in International Relations. Rupal was an intelligence analyst with the CIA from 2005 to 2011 and has since moved into the corporate world, becoming a two-time CEO and best-selling author. Welcome, Rupal.
Thank you so much for having me, Kelly and Paul. I'm really excited to have this conversation.
So why don't you start by telling us just a little bit about what brought you to our CIR MA program in the first place?
I think it was really just the reputation that Chicago has for both its poli-sci department and then, of course, the international affairs department. And I really liked, I think, the ethos of just the university at large, right? This whole idea of the life of the mind and debating ideas and something about just sort of the intellectual rigor and that willingness to engage in dialogue, right, with fellow students and professors, just really, really appeals to me. So it was pretty much a no-brainer when I got to join.
Now, as a faculty member in the political science department, who also advises a number of CIR students, I have to ask, what was your thesis on? And what was your experience of writing that thesis?
Gosh, do you want the honest answer or the university approved answer?
I would like we would love the honest answer.
Okay, good. The honest answer is, a one-year MA is so quick. And I was scrambling. I am a last-minute type of person. And so I was scrambling at the very last minute to write my thesis. And what it was on was ethnic conflict in South Asia. And it was something that was just done with with a lot of time pressure on me, let's say. So I wish I could say something a little bit more sort of erudite and intellectual about the why and the what. But yes, ethnic conflict in South Asia, and I'm pleased to say that even though I put that time pressure on myself, I did do pretty well on my final grades. But yeah, that was my thesis.
Totally understandable. I've advised many a thesis, which is like, it's good enough. Trust me, it's a one-year program. It's about getting a done thesis is the best thesis.
Yeah. Where were you when I was there, Paul? That's what I wanted. Yeah.
I have to expect that that actually puts you in pretty good, prepares you pretty well for something like the CIA, right? Having to do something under extreme pressure where you're analyzing a whole bunch of information and figuring out how to get it into this synthesis for an MA thesis is probably pretty close to what you had to do, right, in your job as an analyst.
Yeah, and also really accepting the limitations of, we have so many people have this notion of like a perfect data set, and that in no world, intelligence, thesis, or otherwise, does it actually exist. But we have this notion that, oh, well, I just need a bit more research or another book or another article. And that's just not that, there is diminishing returns, of course, but also that is just not how it works. And so, yes, I think I hadn't really reflected on it in that way, but you're right. I mean, again, the time pressures of the way I had sort of experienced doing my thesis did really stand me in good stead for all of the work we had to do at the agency, because sometimes you get a question from, for example, the president at, I don't know, 6 o'clock in the evening on a Thursday. He needs an answer by tomorrow morning, and there's only so much more insight that you can glean or get or gather in that intervening sort of 12 hours that you have. So you have to do the best with what you have available. But also, one of the most brilliant takeaways from my time at the CIA that I carry into my work now, even as a consultant and in the corporate world, is acknowledging the boundaries of your data set, right? Saying, this is what we know. And this is the methodology, this is the data set that we have, this is the intelligence that's informed it. But P.S., these are all of the things that we still don't know, either because it's incomplete information or we're still gathering information, but never to pretend that you know more than you do, because especially at a place like the agency, the stakes are really, really high. And so we had it drilled into us that if you were asked a question that you did not have the answer to, you say, I don't know. I will find out and come back to you, but at this moment, or these are the parameters, or these are all of the caveats, but never to make it seem like it was more than what it was.
I really, really love hearing that, because that is, I think, hopefully something that a lot of our master's students, either currently in the program or future master's students, could really appreciate hearing, because I see that a lot of times where students will have an idea for their thesis, they'll start collecting data for it, and then it's like, well, it's not quite showing what I thought it was going to show. And it's like, well, that's okay. We're not going to try to make it fit. Instead, we're going to work with the data we have. We're going to talk about why is it not perhaps showing what it's supposed to be showing. And so I see that a lot, that struggle with students who are in the master's program. So it's fantastic to hear that that kind of skill is also very much translatable into what you were doing for the CIA.
Yeah, and I think also in decision making in any context, right? We're all making decisions personally, professionally, with a limited data set, and yet we always, like you were suggesting there, Paul, there's this pressure to presuppose the answer or to then cherry pick the data that only fits, that this preconceived idea that you have. And what I loved about both the CIA approach and also sort of this the approach that you were just talking about right now is that it sort of mirrors the scientific method, right? You have a thesis, you have an idea that you are trying to test, and then you don't, as it were, torture the evidence until it confesses what you want. You go where the data takes you, or you again then caveat and limit and explain and qualify. But the reality is that, yeah, I mean, life isn't going to serve our thesis in the way that we want. There's no, reason that reality should. And so we have to be willing to go where the information is actually taking us, or at least then ask new questions and different questions.
When you were in CIR in this 1 year quick MA program, you're in classes, you're writing a thesis. Were you also having fun? Were you finding moments where you were able to enjoy Chicago?
Very little, to be honest, and it's such a shame because, and also Hyde Park is so different now than it was when I was there almost, actually, yeah, 20 years ago now. Um, and it was there just last year, and I was stunned. I was like, "Man, you all have it made now, right?" I mean, all of the restaurants and the things to do that just were not there. So to be honest, no. And I think I was so singularly focused on just the coursework, on getting a thesis done, but also the application process for the CIA was incredibly time consuming and grueling. And so there wasn't a lot of downtime to have some of the more yeah, have just a bit more fun in Chicago. I've made up for it after the fact, right? But sadly, while I was in the program, I didn't venture into downtown as much as I would have liked.
Just to pick up on what you were just saying there, so you were going through the application process to the CIA while you're in the CIR program. So when did you actually make the decision that you wanted to go to the CIA? Was it something that you had been thinking about and then you thought, CIR could be a springboard to that, or was it something that came to you as you were in the CIR program and then you started that process?
The CIA came to me physically when I was in the CIR program. And so before then, to be honest, Paul, I had no idea. Again, that 1 year, I was like, oh, this will give me a break, right? I'll figure it out in this year. And then you realize, well, actually, yikes, there's a lot else going on. And so the two things that were on my radar was one, either further study, either in a PhD program in the poli sci department, potentially law school, because that is seemingly what people in my generation did when they didn't know what they wanted to do, or to join the State Department because when I was in undergrad, I had done an internship at State at our embassy in Muscat, Oman, and I loved, again, all of the action and the marrying the theory of foreign policy and foreign affairs with actual practice, and so that was what sort of I was thinking about. And then, as I much later found out, the agency does have a long history of recruiting from Chicago, and so I was part of that sort of, I guess, intake from that year. And I know not from the CIR program, but once I started at the CIA, there were so many of my colleagues and fellow analysts who were Chicago grads. But they came to me. It was not on my radar. It was not something that I had ever dreamed or wished or even imagined was possible because I had no idea that there was a whole analytical cadre within the organization, and so it was just not something I was thinking about. But yeah, once they made that, sort of that offer and invited me to apply, I was like, well, how do you say no to this, right?
Obviously, recognizing there's still limitations on what you can talk about in your time as in the CIA. What does that job look like as an analyst? Like, what does that actually mean day to day? What does your job
It
mean?
is in many ways the dream because you are effectively paid really well to be a continuing grad student, right? You so the role, sort of the paper role of an analyst is to, again, analyze the all of the intelligence, all of the information, what we would sort of jokingly refer to as the fire hose of information that we get on a specific area, specific topic, a specific country, and then make sense of it for policymakers. And so more often than not, we were tasked by the president or someone in the cabinet or, an ambassador and said, hey, what's happening in X country, or what's the dynamic between, these tribal groups, or whatever it is, something that had direct bearing on US foreign policy. And then we had to do the best that we could with the intelligence and information available to us to write briefing papers or brief them in person about certain things. And for the bulk of my time that I was at the agency, I was on our Afghanistan account. So of course that was, fast moving, very timely, very pressing, big, high profile issues. And there was just so much to constantly brief the president that both he wanted to know, but also we thought would be worth bringing to his attention about developments on the ground and how our efforts there were faring. And so that's what you do as an analyst. You make sense of complex data for decision makers so that they can hopefully use that information to make better decisions. And some of that is through writing analytical papers. Some of it is actually giving briefings. A lot of my time I actively sought to spend in the field or outside of headquarters to, collect on the ground intelligence or to work with our partners and allies. And so I could have been a totally desk-based job, but I wanted to make sure that I, wasn't at a place like the CIA and only in Langley for the time that I was there. So yeah, I shaped it in ways that allowed me to do a lot more field work than otherwise.
Well, I could ask all sorts of questions about your role in analyzing Afghanistan and so forth. As a international relations scholar, there's a lot of things I'm curious about, but I'll refrain from having the whole podcast be on that. But I would like to hear about in maybe a particular episode that really stood out during your time there, of maybe where you did have to, whether it was an episode of immense time pressure and maybe what that dealt with, again, within the bounds of what you're actually able to share. And maybe in a way that you, perhaps on reflecting back and relating to what we were just talking about, that you could see where the analytical process that you went through, again, kind of going back to that time pressure idea of working on your thesis, might have actually been a useful skill in that episode.
Oh gosh. Um, I mean, I think there were quite a few, to be honest, and I can't think of sort of any big discrete moment. But I think one of the recurring opportunities for that skill set to shine was when I volunteered to go and serve in Kabul, and my role there was to brief the commanding general in charge of U.S. and international forces. He was sort of my main customer, and in my role out there. And again, he has the interesting complexity of that context was he has his whole own intelligence apparatus, right? The military, the DIA, his own sort of command, his all of his own intelligence officers who are bringing him intel, and then there's me as the civilian briefer who is bringing sort of the agency's insights and analyses to the table. And because you're in a battlefield context, there is a lot more of a requirement for much more up to date, sort of real time information. And sometimes I would find myself in these strange conversations where what we had at headquarters was more updated and sort of real time than some of what his own people were getting in the field. And that's sort of the vagaries of intelligence collection and reporting, et cetera. But I think for me, it was always having to practice that. Well, how can I not bruise any egos or step on any toes and acknowledge the gap between what he's hearing from his own people and what we are able to share from our side, and do it in a way that was politically sensitive slash astute, and kind of so it was less about the time pressure of data necessarily, but more about being able to respond in real time in a way that made sure that your message and your credibility was intact, but to being sensitive to the fact that, in this moment, you might have the slight upper hand and you don't want to you have to be very careful how you're going to sort of play some of those cards. So it was more of sort of like a communications sort of agility that was always sort of present. And to be honest, extending that more broadly is in all of the briefings that we did, either me, individually or as part of my team, you just never know what curveball questions you're going to get, right? So again, that ability to think on your feet and to respond intelligently, both to maybe slightly politically charged questions where they're trying to lead you down a certain path or trying to get you to cherry pick information, and how to push back on that in a way that gets the message across, but also to adapt the way that you communicate to the audience in front of you. So whether when I'm briefing a four-star general versus when I'm briefing 7 8 guys in a special forces base in the middle of nowhere, the granularity, the level of detail, even some of the language and the methodology that you use to communicate has to shift and adapt accordingly. So I think it was that agility. It spanned everything, right? It was the intellectual agility, but also the communications and sort of the, I guess, political agility that you have to display.
Absolutely. No, what comes to mind with that story is it's not just enough to simply allow the data, if you will, to speak for themselves. It's really about how you communicate it, which is, of course, you had very particular ways, as you said, like politically sensitive ways you had to communicate it. But that's something that, again, tying it back to the training we give students, say in the master's programs, it's like, even if they do collect, going back to what we were talking about earlier, even if they do collect the optimal data, wow, this really hits the thesis, well, you still have to communicate clearly that does. So I really like how that story illustrates the need for, yes, you have to have the data, but you also have to be able to communicate it and communicate it properly for the audience. I think it's a great illustration.
Yeah, and I think the challenge for all of I love how intellectual the culture is at Chicago, and all of the sort of that focus on yeah, intellectual integrity and smarts. But what I think sometimes, especially in those very and not necessarily just at Chicago, but what can often happen for individuals who find themselves sort of thriving in those kinds of contexts, we sometimes can rely too much on what the argument is sound and I'm right, and that's important, of course it is, but it's how you get that across to the other person and how you adapt that to the person in front of you. It's not enough to be right, sadly, right? Like that's a huge part of it, but you need to know who you're talking to, what's like happening in their heads, how can you make it relevant to them, and still be true to the data, true to the evidence, all of that kind of stuff. But that willingness to, to not just be like, well, on the face of it, it's obvious, so I shouldn't have to convince you. Well, yeah, I mean, that's not reality, right? So you have to do that extra bit of work to get into the other person's head and find a way to make yourself resonate and make your message resonate with who they are and what they care about.
This is a lesson I've been trying to teach my 13-year-old lately. It's not enough to just be right. You have to be able to communicate it too.
Yeah, indeed, indeed.
So you have this dream job, but it's obviously a very intense job. So can you talk some about the transition you made then from the CIA to the corporate world to what you're now doing?
For sure. I didn't have this vocabulary at the time, but I think I was burnt out. And it was 6 years of really emotionally and intellectually intense work. And again, the stakes were high. The attention on us was really, really high. And also, there's just the human story that's unfolding, right? Especially in Afghanistan. And so I think after working on it, and also the reality was like, because the way politics works, it was sometimes like we were screaming into the wind, right? In many ways, and this is my personal view, not the view of the agency, but my personal view is, the ship had sailed long before I even got involved, and because all of the countries involved, because of just the national politics involved in any war effort, and also just the futility, in my view, of nation building efforts. Full stop. I think I sort of knew where things were going to end up anyway. And it was just frustrating that even though you're doing your best to try to nudge things in a certain direction or inform things in a way that will hopefully mitigate like the potential worst case scenario of things, there was no way, like, you did your best, but the president doesn't have to listen to you, right? You're just there to give him information, or the policymakers or the people on the ground. They don't have to take anything you say and act on it. And for me, that was the biggest frustration was that gap between the knowing and the doing. And it's not to say that we were always right, of course not, right? But being a part of a process where you're informing policymakers and you just feel like, well, what was the point of that, right? Like after a while, it really does start to wear you down. And so yeah, I think I was burned out. And I initially thought that I would take a break and maybe come back, sort of see what else the world had to offer, because it's such also an insular and a very specific universe that you inhabit when you're in the intelligence community, but particularly at the CIA. And I had no idea what else was out there in the world. And so going to business school seemed like a nice way to, again, take a bit of a break, to go back to my happy place, which is school and learning and academic environments, and just recalibrate and see sort of what would happen next, and then maybe go back if I wanted to, but that wasn't really what I had in mind. It was sort of a nice mental safety net, but it wasn't one that I thought I would ever really rely on. And then I spent the 2 years of, getting my MBA really just exploring what else the world had to offer, which is infinite, right? I mean, there's so much opportunity. There's so many things that I could do and was had my eyes opened to. But I think I left for that reason. There was no big push, there was no big pull, there was nothing that I was desperate to do on the outside. It was more just I need a break and let's see what else is out there.
Picking up on this narrative, you're now at business school, and as you say, there's infinite possibilities. So, what led you down the path to basically becoming a CEO?
Initially, I did what I thought everybody, well, what again, the culture of MBA programs sort of has suffused throughout it is you go into consulting or you go into banking, right? Those are sort of the like the most impressive credentials that you can put on your resume after you graduate. And so I toyed around with consulting. It also made sense from a narrative perspective, like the types of skills I was using at the agency, analysis, helping decision makers, making sense of complex data, all of that's great stuff, had the most direct transferability in a management consulting context. But it just wasn't for me. And, over time, I just felt like I was just going through the motions and it wasn't, my heart wasn't in it. I didn't really want to be a consultant, not because there's anything wrong with it, but like it just didn't speak to me. And so there was this constant trial and error or experiment and learn what I didn't want, but not really know any more about what I did want. And through this multiple year process of experimentation and trying and stuff, and I just thought, you know what, actually, I don't want to work for anybody else ever again, if I can help it, right? And so the how do I do that? Well, I start my own business. Okay, in what? And then again, going through the process. I'm an ideas person, and I'm a multi. I guess the in the parlance of the day, right? Multi hyphenate, multi passionate, and so it was a lot of all of that, like just trying different things and seeing what fit. And what I sort of decided on in the end was my first business, which is in real estate investment and construction. And there are many reasons for the why that in particular, but one of the most fundamental that is not just about what you are doing. It was I loved that it was tangible. There was something so nice in having come from a knowledge economy sort of type of role into something that was very physical that I could point to, that gap that I just mentioned a few seconds ago of like, well, you do all of this great work at the agency and you deliver this impactful briefing, but then who knows what, right? Whereas in real estate, there's a before and an after, right? There's something that you can touch and point to in a transformation that you can be proud of and that is because of you. And that really, I think I my without sounding too sort of whatever about it, like I think my soul sort of needed that, right? Something very concrete. But in all honesty, even while I was growing and scaling that business, I was like, this isn't it for me, right? Like I love real estate. I'm still interested in it. And again, there are many big and small things that I appreciate about it. But even as I was growing that, I was like, but this isn't it, right? This can be part of a multi-port, whatever portfolio career, whatever we're calling it these days. And so I was always not keeping my eyes open for something to suddenly shift to, right? Because I knew I had to focus on this and build it and scale it before I could pivot to anything else. But just again, in small ways, just doing things to just test the waters in other ways. And all along that growth journey, I was always being asked for advice. I was always being asked by other founders, by other eventually other leaders about very specific questions, and I loved that. It was some of what I loved most about the work at the CIA was developing an expertise in something and then using that expertise to help other people. And so that sort of the real estate business sort of got me into then the private sector of like advising and mentoring and coaching, et cetera. And then when that business was big enough and self-sufficient enough for me to then formalize some of the coaching and the mentoring and the consulting, then I pivoted to that. But it was never this big sort of planned out trajectory. It was something very organic that came from trial and error, experimentation, knowing what I like, knowing what I don't like, and trying to do more of the stuff that I was uniquely qualified to do. I really enjoyed doing, and I was really good at. Right, like that. It's not, and that other people valued, and that I think was sort of the multi-stage process that led me to where I am now.
No, I like how you related that back to the part of your time at the CIA that you were dissatisfied with. You literally said concrete. You wanted something concrete, both figuratively and literally,
Yeah,
to be able to point to.
yeah,
In contrast to, as you very well said, there was times you put in all this work, you put it forward when you're at the CIA, and it's like it's just out of your hands about whether it actually matters. And but that makes so much sense, as you say, that in many ways then kind of guided you towards going on a path where not just that you wanted to be your own boss, but as you say, you wanted to make sure that the things you were working on had an impact, actually something physically you could point to, or as you say, that you're helping people, that people are actually hearing your advice and maybe making use of it, as opposed to saying, thank you for that report, I'm now going to do what I want to do anyhow.
exactly. Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. And look, to be honest, I think that is probably one of the biggest strengths of the CIA, right? Is that we are not policy prescriptive. That is not our job. And so I knew that going in. And I remember very vividly, actually, the first interview I had with the person who recruited me on campus. He's like, look, like, what about this interests you? And I said, oh, well, we can inform policy and, we can do. And he's like, look, I just want to be very clear with you. You can do the best analysis in the world, but we have zero, like that is not our job. It is not to tell policymakers what to do. It's to inform them so that they can choose with eyes wide open. But we have zero ability, and it's not our role to tell them what to do. And he's like, so is that going to be a problem for you? And I, did the good interview thing where I was like, oh no, of course not. If that's the job, that's the job, right? And I sort of believed it for a little while, but I am much more of a sort of I'm getting really geeky about this. I'm much more Newtonian, right? Like I really like the cause and effect. I'm not in that context, right? And I did it for a while, and I did my job. I did it very, very well, and I got a lot from that career. But yeah, I think for me, I just needed a bit more certainty about the impact that I was having, because fundamentally for me, that's what all of my work is about. Is like, how can I have a positive impact, and how can I know what my impact is going to be? You can never know the full impact of everything any of us do, but for me, yeah, like that causality was really, really important.
So I think that takes us neatly to the book that you've written.
Yeah.
So I would love to hear about the process of deciding to write a book and then writing the book. And this is, of course, a very different style of writing than a master's thesis, for instance, or a policy brief for the CIA. But we can certainly see. I've read your book. I think Paul read your book as well. I think we can certainly see your analyst brain in this kind of writing as well. So can you talk to us some about the writing of this book?
Oh my gosh. I think one of the most gratifying things about the book was that I was just able to be, or felt like I gave myself permission to be fully myself. And I can't think of many contexts in which that is or had been sort of true. And what I mean by fully myself is, yeah, I'm such a dork. Like I am such a geek. I have this like analytical bent of mind, but I'm a little, but I'm also philosophical. I also make really corny jokes. I'm also like, I do some like cool things, and I have a bit of a badass edge. And it was just nice to be able to be all of those things in one place, because all of us are very complex and have different elements to who we are, but we dial them up or dial them down depending on the context, and that's just life, right? That's not, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I think, and this is the first time I've actually said this out loud, but I think one of the things that was so rewarding about it, it was like, this is me. It's also very much my voice. Every other thing that I've ever written professionally has a very specific style, and it's much more buttoned up, and at the CIA it's sort of a journalistic style. This was just me, like having a conversation with readers. I in many ways speak the way I write anyway, and so it was a real pleasure. I mean, it genuinely was a labor of love, and it had been a long time in the making. I had always, ever since I was a child, I've always loved to write. I have this great anecdote I love to share because I think it tells you a lot about what a dork and what a writer I am. Is back in the day of VCRs when Superman 2 came out, I was a child and I remember vividly sitting on my parents' bedroom, hitting stop, like transcribing the entire movie just because I loved the physical act of writing. I wasn't creating anything. I was just hitting play, writing some words down, hitting pause. Like it was so tedious, but like that also reflects a different side of my personality, which is slightly, when I get into something, I just obsess over it. And so I've always been a writer in some form, and writing and words have played a huge role in my life and ideas. And so the book was, in many ways, sort of 35, 40 years in the making. But in the iteration in which it came out into the world, it was probably closer to 5 or 6 years in the making, in the sense of the conversations I was having with other people, with people I was advising or that I was consulting with, conversations I was having with myself as I'm going through some of the ups and downs of all of the things that I do, right? Being a parent, being a business owner, being a CEO, building, various businesses, all of the, again, the multifacets. And so finally, the pain of not having like written it down in words for, in a coherent way was so much greater than the idea of how painful it would be to actually write it. So after, much sort of navel gazing and hand wringing, I was like, This is just, I can't not do this." And so the sort of the more boring technical part of it was I just really needed help with um, some of the structure. I'm good at, as many of us, we're good at helping others with things that we struggle with ourselves sometimes. And so I had this universe of ideas and insights and stories that I wanted to share that I thought would help other people. But it was so large, I couldn't make sense of it all, and I felt a bit paralyzed. And so I hired a book coach to help me through some of that early, just very shell of getting to a shell of a structure. And once we hit the point where I had worked with her to get to a table of contents, the rest of it was just, I mean, it was a breeze. I had these ideas, I had the phrases, I had the conversations in my head for so long, I was able to fill in those gaps. But getting to that point of what gaps am I filling in, that was really, really difficult for me.
What I love about what you just said is about how writing this book, in many ways, was very different than the other types of writing you've done. And relating back to what we were talking about earlier, we were discussing about how a lot of the other writing you have to think of who you're talking to and you have to calibrate it to who you're talking to. Whereas you said writing this book, it was truly that was not what you had to do. Instead, it was this is what I want to say, this is how I want to say it. And once you knew what to say, you just said it.
Yes, in many ways, yes, but also some of the trick that a lot of folks have said to me, other writers have said, is like, but also when you are writing, like who are you talking to, right? And do you have like a person that you're envisioning? And for me, for so much of what I write now is I'm kind of writing to myself at a different stage in my life. And so a lot of the book in some ways is kind of self-indulgent, right? It's like I say the things that I needed to hear at whatever stage in the past because I know that so many of these things are universal and that others will at some point need or want to hear it or have something that they will get from hearing it. And so a lot of the times when I'm writing, in a weird way, I'm kind of writing to myself. Like that is the audience, right? Or a different version of myself, which is kind of weird when you think about it, right? But yeah, there was always still an audience, and I think fundamentally for this book in particular, the audience is just, it's kind of Chicago people, right? Like thinkers, people who like ideas and mulling over ideas, who are a bit reflective, but instead of reflecting on the outside and on the external stuff and all of the ideas in the world, it's like reflecting on yourself, and that's a huge part of big portion of that book is about turning that analytical gaze inward, which we so rarely do or have the time or the luxury to do. And I know how much I benefited from taking that time to sort of reflect inward. And so that self-analysis piece is a lot of it.
So we should probably give listeners an idea of how to get the book. So can you please tell them that?
Anywhere you get books, so hopefully an indie bookshop near you, but it is on Amazon if that's your sort of bookseller of choice. But yeah, it's at Barnes and Noble, Amazon, Target, all of the places you would normally get your books from.
Paul, do you want to ask our signature last question?
Yes, I can ask the signature last question, which is there anything we should have asked you about?
Not that I can think of, but there was somebody asked me this question once, and I thought it was such a brilliant question. I had been I had been interviewed on this podcast, and the sort of the nature of the podcast is, sort of how you define success. And the question she asked that I loved so much was, "What is the thing that you are proudest of that either nobody knows or won't show up on your resume?" And I thought that was such a cool question because, again, it sort of reflects back on this bigger idea and bigger conception of success and how we define it for ourselves and all these other things. But the answer I gave her, and which is still true to this day, is the thing I am proudest of is that in pretty much every interaction I have with people, they leave either inspired or feeling like they have an insight that they didn't have before we had that conversation. And there's no way to put that on a resume, right? And why would I? But it is something that I am genuinely proud of because, like, I think the world just needs a lot more inspiration and a lot more conversations that leave you feeling not like a victim, not depressed, not overwhelmed by the scale and the enormity of what's happening around you, but just like a person who has agency and can do something and then go and do it. So that is not a question that, yeah, often comes up, but it is something that I am deeply proud of.
Saying I'm helpful is not often something we put on our CV, even though that probably is ultimately one of the most important things we can do.
Exactly.
Rupal, thank you so much for speaking with us. It's been
Yes.
just an absolute pleasure.
Oh, I love it. I love everything about Chicago, and this is a delight to have a chat with both of you. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us.